On the 9th of March 1966, Ronnie Kray walked into a London pub, looked his rival in the eye, and ended the man's life in front of a room full of witnesses. Everyone saw his face. Everyone knew what had happened. And yet, when police arrived, not a single person could identify the man responsible. For more than a decade, the Kray twins had ruled London's underworld with absolute impunity. They dined with Frank Sinatra. They were photographed by David Bailey. They owned nightclubs where celebrities rubbed shoulders with criminals, and no one dared speak their names to the police. Ronnie himself boasted that he and his brother were untouchable. He was wrong. Within 3 years, both twins would stand convicted at the Old Bailey, sentenced to spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Their empire, built over 15 years, collapsed in a matter of months, and it all came down to a single fatal mistake, a moment of arrogance that shattered the silence protecting them. This is the story of how two of Britain's most feared gangsters destroyed everything they had built. If you find stories like this fascinating, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. You will not want to miss what comes next. On the 24th of October 1933, in a small terraced house on Steen Street in Hoxton, a woman named Violet Kray gave birth to twin boys. Reggie arrived first, 10 minutes before his brother Ronnie. In the East End of that era, where infant mortality among working-class families remained stubbornly high, the successful delivery and survival of twins was considered something close to miraculous. Violet became a minor celebrity in her neighborhood, admired for raising 2 healthy boys when so many mothers lost at least one child before they reached adulthood. The twins' father, Charles Kray, was a dealer in second-hand goods, a man who drifted in and out of the family home and who would later spend 15 years on the run after deserting from military service during the Second World War. His absence shaped the household in ways both obvious and subtle. Violet became the center of the boys' universe, a figure of absolute devotion whose approval they craved and whose affection they competed for throughout their lives. Ronnie would later say that they had their mother and they had each other and they never needed anyone else. There was an older brother too, Charlie, 6 years their senior and destined to walk a quieter path through the criminal world. But it was the twins who drew attention from the very beginning. Cousins and neighbors recalled something unusual about them, a closeness that went beyond ordinary sibling bonds, a way of communicating without words, of moving through the world as a single unit. They were inseparable, and they were different. The East End of their childhood was a place shaped by poverty, by war, and by a code of loyalty that valued silence above almost everything else. The phrase, "thou shalt not grass," was not merely a suggestion, but a commandment, a rule enforced by social pressure and, when necessary, by violence. The Metropolitan Police were viewed with suspicion at best and open hostility at worst. This was the world that formed Ronnie and Reggie Kray, and it was a world they would one day dominate. Their grandfather, Jimmy Lee, known locally as Cannonball, had been a bare-knuckle fighter of some repute. Under his influence, the twins took up boxing, and both showed genuine promise. Reggie, in particular, possessed the skill and discipline to have pursued a professional career. He moved well, hit hard, and understood the tactical side of the sport. Some who knew him in those days believed he could have been a contender, perhaps even a champion. But the twins had already glimpsed another path, one that offered faster rewards and fewer rules. In 1952, like all young men of their generation, Ronnie and Reggie were called up for national service. They reported to the Royal Fusiliers and promptly attempted to leave. When a corporal tried to stop them, Ronnie struck him in the jaw. The twins walked home to the East End and were arrested the following morning. It was the beginning of a pattern that would define their relationship with authority. They assaulted a police constable while absent without leave. They were transferred to Shepton Mallet military prison to await court-martial, and in a detail that would later add to their legend, they became among the last prisoners ever held in the Tower of London. Their behavior behind bars was so disruptive that both eventually received dishonorable discharges. They had thrown tantrums, emptied a latrine bucket over a sergeant, scolded a guard with hot tea, handcuffed another to their cell bars, and set their bedding alight. The army wanted nothing more to do with them. For the Krays, this was not a disgrace, but a liberation. The legitimate world had rejected them, and they were free to build something of their own. By the mid-1950s, the twins had acquired a billiard hall on Mile End Road. It was a modest beginning, but it served as the foundation for everything that followed. The hall became a base of operations, a place where young men looking for work of a particular kind could find it, and where local businessmen could be persuaded to pay for protection they had not requested. The methods were straightforward: a visit from one of the Krays' associates, a quiet conversation about the dangers of operating without friends, and, if persuasion failed, a demonstration of what those dangers might look like. The gang that coalesced around the twins became known as the Firm, a name that suggested something almost corporate, a business enterprise with a clear hierarchy and defined roles. Ronnie and Reggie sat at the top, of course, but beneath them were lieutenants, enforcers, drivers, and specialists of various kinds. The Firm engaged in protection rackets, armed robbery, arson for hire, and the fencing of stolen goods. They moved into long-firm fraud, a scheme in which a seemingly legitimate business would build up credit with suppliers before vanishing with a large order of goods. It was unglamorous work, but it was profitable. What set the Krays apart from other East End criminals was their ambition. They did not merely want to survive, or even to prosper in the shadows. They wanted recognition. They wanted respect. And in 1960, they got their chance. A landlord named Peter Rackman, notorious for his ruthless treatment of tenants in properties across London, offered Reggie a nightclub called Esmeralda's Barn in Knightsbridge. Rackman wanted protection from rivals and saw the Krays as useful allies. For the twins, the club represented something far more significant than another revenue stream. It was an entry point into a different world. Esmeralda's Barn attracted a clientele that would have seemed unimaginable to the boys from Steen Street. Aristocrats and actors, politicians and pop stars, they all passed through its doors. The Krays cultivated these connections with care. They were photographed with celebrities. They donated to charities. They presented themselves as successful businessmen who happened to come from humble origins. East End boys made good. The newspapers were fascinated. Here were gangsters who dressed like film stars and socialized with the elite. It was a story too compelling to resist. The twins understood the power of image. They dressed in dark, double-breasted suits with tight-knotted ties and shoulder-padded overcoats, a style borrowed directly from the Hollywood gangster films they adored. George Raft, the American actor famous for playing mobsters on screen, became a personal friend and a frequent visitor to their clubs. The Krays were not merely criminals, they were performers, playing a role they had studied and rehearsed until it became indistinguishable from reality. By the early 1960s, their influence had expanded far beyond the East End. They had connections with the American mafia, brokered through figures like Meyer Lansky and Angelo Bruno, who saw London as a potential base for money laundering now that their operations in Cuba had been shut down by the revolution. The Krays facilitated the redemption of stolen bonds from Canada, taking a handsome cut for their services. They were players on an international stage, or so they believed. Throughout this ascent, the twins remained untouchable in the eyes of the law.
Investigations were launched and then quietly abandoned. Witnesses developed sudden amnesia. The wall of silence that surrounded East End criminals held firm around the Krays, reinforced by a combination of loyalty, fear, and the widespread belief that cooperating with the police was the worst of all possible betrayals. Detective Inspector Leonard Reed, a compact and determined officer who had earned the nickname Nipper for his slight stature, began investigating the Krays in 1964. He found the wall nearly impenetrable. Every lead dissolved, every potential witness recanted or disappeared. And then, in a humiliating episode, Reed was photographed at a social event appearing friendly with Ronnie Kray. The image was published. Letters of complaint flooded Scotland Yard. Reed was removed from the investigation and reassigned to other duties. The twins celebrated. They had outmaneuvered the police once again. Their sense of invincibility, already considerable, expanded into something approaching delusion. Ronnie, in particular, began to speak of himself as a figure of historical importance, a man destined for greatness. He styled himself the Colonel and dreamed of building a criminal organization modeled on the American Mafia, a British version of the legendary Murder Incorporated. But behind the bespoke suits and the celebrity photographs, behind the nightclub glamour and the carefully managed public image, something was profoundly wrong. Ronnie Kray was not merely ambitious or ruthless, he was ill, and his illness was growing worse. Those who knew him well had seen the signs for years, the sudden mood swings, the paranoid suspicions, the episodes of violence that seemed to come from nowhere and subside just as quickly. In 1958, while serving a grievous bodily harm sentence, Ronnie had suffered a complete breakdown. He was transferred to Long Grove Mental Hospital in Surrey, where doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia. He was certified insane.
Reggie, unwilling to accept that his brother might be confined indefinitely, orchestrated a remarkable escape. The twins wore identical suits during a prison visit. At the right moment, they switched places, and Ronnie simply walked out of the hospital while Reggie remained behind to be discovered. It was audacious, it was illegal, and it worked. Ronnie was hidden in safe houses and supplied with medication by a compliant doctor until the legal situation could be resolved. But medication could only do so much. Ronnie's condition fluctuated. On good days, he was charming, generous, even capable of kindness. On bad days, he was terrifying. A man whose eyes seemed to look through you, who could turn violent without warning or provocation. Members of the firm learned to read his moods and to stay clear when the darkness descended. The empire the Krays had built was magnificent in its way, a testament to their cunning, their ruthlessness, and their understanding of the world they had emerged from. But it was also fragile, held together by fear and dependent on the continued belief that the twins were untouchable. Ronnie's instability threatened that belief. His grandiose fantasies, his obsession with status and respect, his need to prove himself superior to everyone around him, these were not the qualities of a careful businessman. They were the qualities of a man racing toward catastrophe. And the catastrophe, when it came, would begin with a grudge, a gun, and a pub on Whitechapel Road. To understand what happened next, it is necessary to understand Ronnie Kray. Not the legend, but the man himself. When Ronnie was just a few days old, he contracted diphtheria and nearly died. Doctors offered little hope, but his mother Violet refused to accept their verdict. She took him home and laid him beside his twin brother Reggie. Within days, Ronnie began to recover. Some who knew the family believed the illness left its mark. From childhood, Ronnie suffered night terrors and violent mood swings. He could be affectionate one moment and savage the next. As the twins grew into manhood, the differences between them became pronounced. Reggie was the strategist, the one who understood that lasting power required patience, His violence was purposeful, a tool rather than an end in itself. Ronnie was something else entirely. He seemed to crave violence, to need it. When he hurt someone, there was a satisfaction in his eyes that unsettled even hardened criminals. His obsession with the American Mafia deepened. He studied Al Capone and Lucky Luciano, adopted their mannerisms, and began calling himself the Colonel. He wanted to be treated as a figure of historical importance, and those who failed to show proper deference faced his wrath. By the mid-1960s, tensions with the Richardson brothers, a rival gang from South London, were escalating. At the Astor Club in late 1965, a Richardson associate named George Cornell reportedly directed a slur at Ronnie, a reference to his sexuality that struck at the core of his carefully constructed image. Ronnie was incandescent with rage. The situation exploded on the 7th of March 1966. A confrontation at Mr. Smith's nightclub in Catford left several men wounded, including Richard Hart, a Kray associate, who died from his injuries. Many believed George Cornell was responsible. When word reached Ronnie that Dickie Hart was gone, something shifted in him. He began speaking of Cornell with an intensity that alarmed even those accustomed to his rages. Reggie counseled patience. The Richardson gang was in disarray. Time was on their side. But Ronnie was beyond patience. He had been insulted. His friend had been taken from him. And 2 days after Hart's funeral, he received a telephone call. Cornell had been spotted at a pub in Whitechapel, deep in Kray territory, drinking as if nothing had happened. For Ronnie, this was an intolerable provocation. He collected his weapon, called for his driver, and walked out into the March evening. The pub was called the Blind Beggar, and what happened inside would set in motion the destruction of everything the twins had built.
The evening of the 9th of March 1966 was unremarkable in most respects. At the Blind Beggar pub on Whitechapel Road, a handful of customers had gathered in the dim interior. George Cornell arrived sometime before 8 o'clock with his friend Albie Woods. They ordered light ales and took seats at the bar. A record was playing on the jukebox, something melancholy about sunshine and loss. It was the kind of scene that played out in pubs across London every evening. At approximately 8:30, the door opened. Ronnie Kray entered first, followed by Ian Barry. Their driver, Scotch Jack Dixon, remained outside in the car with the engine running. Ronnie's eyes swept the room and found what they were looking for. Cornell turned at the sound of footsteps. When he saw who had entered, his expression shifted into something almost amused. He spoke a few casual words, the kind of greeting one might offer to an unexpected acquaintance. They were the last words George Cornell ever spoke. Barry fired twice into the ceiling as a warning. Ronnie walked forward, raised his weapon, and ended Cornell's life with a single shot. Then both men turned and left, climbing into the waiting car and disappearing into the London evening. Cornell was rushed to hospital, but the wound was catastrophic. At 29 minutes past 10, he was pronounced dead. The news spread through the East End with remarkable speed. By morning, everyone knew what had happened and who was responsible. The Krays made no effort to hide. They returned to their usual haunts and conducted their usual business. It was not merely a taking of life, it was a proclamation. The police response was swift but futile. Officers questioned everyone present at the pub. The barmaid said she had been looking the other way. The old man reading a newspaper claimed poor eyesight. Albie Woods insisted everything had happened too fast. One by one, potential witnesses retreated behind the wall of silence that protected the Krays. Ronnie was brought in for questioning.
He denied everything, claimed he had been elsewhere, surrounded by friends who would confirm his whereabouts. The police had no case. They were forced to release him. In the days following, a dark celebration swept through the firm. Ronnie had done it. He had acted in front of witnesses and walked away untouched. The wall of silence had held. Everything the Krays had built seemed validated in the most dramatic way possible. For Ronnie, this was proof of his invincibility. The act had achieved everything he hoped, but it had also taught him a dangerous lesson. He now believed he could get away with anything, and if he was untouchable, why should he stop? In the months following, Ronnie's behavior grew increasingly erratic. His paranoia deepened, and he began to pressure his brother, suggesting that Reggie had not proven himself in the same way, that the twins could only be truly equal when both had demonstrated the same willingness to act. Reggie resisted, but his resistance was weakening. His marriage to Frances Shay had collapsed. She had left him after only 2 months, struggling with a depression that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Reggie drank heavily, watched helplessly as the woman he loved retreated further from him. And all the while, Ronnie whispered in his ear. The clock was ticking toward October of 1967, toward a basement flat in Stoke Newington, and a man named Jack who had made the fatal mistake of thinking he could cheat the Kray twins.
In April of 1965, Reggie Kray married Frances Shay at St. James the Great Church in Bethnal Green. It was the East End wedding of the year. David Bailey photographed the day. Diana Dawes was among the guests. The bride wore ivory satin, her beauty drawing comparisons to Brigitte Bardot. It should have been a triumph. But the marriage was troubled from the start. Within 2 months, Frances had left Reggie and returned to her parents. Those who knew the couple spoke of his drinking, his absences, his rages, and the suffocating presence of his twin brother. Frances struggled with deepening depression. She was admitted to hospital for months. In October 1966 and again in January 1967, she attempted to end her own life. Both times she was saved. On the 7th of June 1967, Frances Shay did not wake up. Her brother found her in bed at his flat in Hackney. She had taken an overdose during the night. She was 23 years old. Reggie was devastated. He began drinking more heavily than ever. His attention to the firm's business faltered. Something inside him had broken. Into this void stepped Ronnie, sensing his brother's vulnerability and exploiting it with relentless pressure. He reminded Reggie that the twins were not yet equal, that Reggie had not demonstrated the same willingness to act. There was a man named Jack McViti, and he had made a serious mistake. McViti was a minor criminal known as Jack the Hat for the trilby he wore to conceal his baldness. Earlier that year, Ronnie had paid him £500 to eliminate a man named Leslie Payne. McViti never completed the job. He took the money, spent it on drink and drugs, and then boasted about cheating the Krays in pubs across London. He even brandished weapons and threatened anyone who mentioned the twins' name. Word reached Ronnie, and his response was predictable. McViti had to be dealt with. If one man could cheat them and walk away, others would follow. The empire depended on absolute certainty that crossing the Krays meant destruction. On the 29th of October 1967, the twins learned that a party was taking place at a flat on Evering Road in Stoke Newington. They arrived first and cleared out the guests. Then a message was sent to Jack McViti. There would be drinks, he was told. There would be money. McViti arrived around midnight, drunk from a wedding reception. He walked down the stairs into the basement flat and found himself face to face
with Reggie Kray. What happened next unfolded with terrible speed. Reggie's weapon jammed. McViti lunged for a window and managed to get his head through before the others dragged him back inside. Ronnie seized him from behind. Reggie was handed a knife, and then, in front of multiple witnesses, Reggie attacked McViti repeatedly until the man stopped moving. The twins left immediately. The body was wrapped in bedding and eventually disposed of at sea near New Haven. It was never recovered. The McViti incident was different from Cornell. It had been chaotic, frenzied, witnessed by members of the firm who now bound to the crime. These men understood something the Krays could not grasp. If the twins could do this to one of their own, they could do it to anyone. The fear that had once protected the Krays now worked against them. Their associates began to wonder who might be next. And somewhere in London, Detective Leonard Reed was watching.
Reed had first investigated the Krays in 1964, but the inquiry collapsed when a photograph surfaced suggesting familiarity between detective and gangster. He was removed from the case and reassigned. It was a humiliation he would not forget. But Reed never stopped thinking about the twins. He understood that their power rested on a single foundation, the certainty that no one would ever testify against them. Break that certainty and the empire would crumble. In 1967, Reed was given command of a new investigation. This time, he established headquarters at Tintagel House, away from Scotland Yard, to prevent leaks. He assembled a small, trusted team and began mapping the Kray organization, identifying every associate and business interest. His strategy was psychological as much as investigative. He spread rumors that informants had already come forward, creating doubt within the firm. Members began to wonder who might already be talking. Paranoia, always one of Ronnie's defining characteristics, began infecting the entire organization. Reed recognized his dilemma. Moving too soon might result in acquittals. Waiting too long risked losing momentum. In the end, he decided to act. The Krays were most dangerous when free. Once in custody, the dynamics would shift. People too frightened to speak might find their courage. On the morning of the 8th of May 1968, Reed coordinated dawn raids across London. More than 100 officers struck simultaneously at multiple locations. The Krays were found at their mother's council flat in Finsbury. Neither offered resistance. In total, the raids netted the twins and 15 members of the firm. Reed then began turning the arrested men against each other. He met with each prisoner individually and laid out the situation. Those who cooperated might receive consideration. Those who did not would face full consequences. The first to break was Albert Donahue, Reggie's right-hand man. When the twins sent word that he should plead guilty like a loyal soldier, Donahue refused. He told Reed everything. Others followed. Ronnie Hart provided detailed testimony about the McViti incident. Scotch Jack Dixon confirmed his role in the Cornell affair. And finally, the barmaid from the Blind Beggar agreed to testify. With the twins in custody and police protection available, her fear had begun to ebb. On the 23rd of January 1969, the trial began at the Old Bailey. Security was unprecedented. The public gallery was packed daily, with seats reportedly changing hands for £5 apiece. For nearly 3 months, witness after witness took the stand. The barmaid identified Ronnie. Ronnie Hart described the McViti scene in graphic detail. The evidence was overwhelming. The twins maintained their defiance throughout. Ronnie seemed to view the proceedings as a performance. Reggie was more subdued, the weight of everything visible in his face. On the 4th of March 1969, after deliberating for nearly 7 hours, the jury returned. Ronnie Kray was guilty of the Cornell incident. Reggie Kray was guilty of the McViti incident. Both were guilty of being accessories to the other's crime. Justice Melford Stevenson addressed the twins before sentencing. His words were sparse and devastating. Society, he said, had earned a rest from their activities. He sentenced both men to life imprisonment with a recommendation of 30 years minimum, the longest sentence ever handed down at the Old Bailey. The Kray twins were led from the dock. They were 35 years old. They would never be free again.
The question lingers across the decades. What was the mistake that destroyed their empire? The answer seems obvious. They committed acts of violence in circumstances that created witnesses, and those witnesses eventually talked. But this explanation misses something deeper. The Krays did not fall because they were careless. They fell because they stopped believing the rules applied to them. For more than a decade, the twins had operated within a system they understood. The East End Code of Silence was real, built on generations of distrust toward authority. They exploited this code ruthlessly, but they also respected its limits. Their violence had been largely directed at other criminals who accepted certain risks as the price of their trade.
The mistake that destroyed the Kray Empire was not a single act, but a pattern of thinking. They came to believe their own legend. They convinced themselves they were untouchable.